Yeah, so this week we were going to talk about chapters 7 and 8, I think, right? And so agriculture again, cities, but seems like they are kind of running with this narrative. And I mean, and it seemed to me like they were adding a lot of actual, kind of useful information from a bunch of different places. We had in the earlier session, we had a little bit of a talk, continued a little bit of a talk about, sort of some ideas of that people still have about, kind of tone and, and really, I think a little bit still this idea of, who writes for, how do people change their writing? One of the things I did this week was I actually went back to that article that Graeber and Wengrow had written in about 2015, right? That was the journal article that kind of led to the book project. And my impression of it was it seemed to be much more kind of straightforward and, and sort of fact, kind of thesis statement, supporting fact, supporting fact, supporting fact, supporting fact, argument, conclusion kind of thing. Very, what you would expect. Whereas this seems to be, I don't know, to me, this seems to be a whole lot looser and a kind of meandering in a way that I'm not entirely comfortable with. How do you guys feel about it?
Yeah, I feel like the last several chapters have felt like really in the weeds. And I think the first couple chapters are kind of following the argument. They said, well, it's not really this question, it's this question. But then the last couple chapters, I'm like, I'm not sure what their argument is. And part of me is thinking maybe I need to read their conclusion, like the conclusion chapter, and then come back and a lot of this stuff will make more sense. But I've kind of just felt like, okay, like I'm going to kind of trudge along and I'm not paying too much attention to the details of a lot of these things. I'm trying to get maybe what their argument is. And then when I get to the end, maybe I can put it back together again. I don't know.
Yeah, I was kind of disappointed a little bit. I mean, I have listened to the thing and kind of made my highlights all the way through. And now I'm kind of going through, each week and looking at it, a little bit more closely a second time. But I don't know that I think I was a little bit disappointed with the conclusion the first time around, that it was just a, it was almost kind of a George H.W. Bush, kinder, gentler America, 1,000 points of light kind of, okay, it is, it's more complicated and, and I think they do sort of conclusively put a stake through the heart of the idea that there was one way that people were in prehistory and all of that, but I mean, to some extent those are, well, they're not straw men, right? Because they have been the mainstream sort of accepted explanation of the past, the prehistoric past. But I think that Wengrow, in some of the things that I've watched that he's done, since Graeber's death, and since the book has come out, he has, kind of said a lot of times that a lot of this information is stuff that is not going to be new to people in the field, right? That professionals know these things, right? And professionals know that kind of, I mean, it's almost like in the kind of Kuhnian paradigm story, right? The anomalies have been accumulating, right? And these new things that people have been finding out with, at places like Göbekli Tepe, and which apparently is not only older than most of the other megalithic sites that they found, but also bigger. And they didn't. I don't think they mentioned it, but was listening to something else recently, the last week or so, that said that there is more, with ground penetrating radar, they've found, they've basically established that there is more under the ground that they haven't uncovered yet, than they had previously thought. And, to the point where, it may be, not only the oldest thing they found, but the biggest thing they've ever found too, which is interesting. So I think it's almost like a first kind of little exploratory mission into this, this territory that at least to the general public was kind of uncharted, but but maybe wasn't quite as much to people in the field. But if that's the case, is that enough value? Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to. I don't think I convinced anyone last week, but I have tried to tease out a positive argument from them out of what I read from them, and I don't think I convinced anyone last week. So there's no reason for me to recapitulate that. However, once you get the overall structure of what they're trying to do, I think today's readings were relatively straightforward. Today's readings were against or destructive or critical of two determinist approaches to social science, history. To me, it's all the same thing. Mm-hmm. So the first chapter we read was an argument against the kind of determinism that, we've already seen these arguments before, that the mode of production, the way of producing, determines social structure. Now, they never define any of these terms, but what is it? What did we read? 7 and 8? I think that's what we read, 7 and 8, right? Okay. Yeah. So 7 was the argument that the agricultural mode of production, that is domestication of plants and animals, when you produce via agriculture, that does not determine relationships of domination or lack of those relationships. And the proof being all of the examples in chapter 7, that you can have the same, kind, not the same, but the same kind of agriculture, same kind of mode of production, and you can have a variety of relationships of domination or hierarchy, ranging from completely absent or present in a very strong way. Mm-hmm. And then chapter 8 was another anti-determinist argument. It said that what they call scale, I guess I would like to say something like degree of aggregation of population, right? They're saying there is a kind of determinism which says that as the aggregate size of the as population size increases.
Is it size or density, though?
All right. They don't define it as far as I can see. No, that's what I'm saying. They don't define mode of production. They don't even define social structure. They give these hints of the 3 kinds of freedom, and they criticize egalitarianism. But then if these 2 chapters, they kept saying, this is a very equal society. And it's like, can't you guys at least be consistent enough and say, we're not going to talk about egalitarianism because we've already trashed that concept? We're going to talk about degrees of freedom. Anyway, that's just me being picky again. So yes, Dan, you're right. We should specify all of this stuff, especially if you're establishing a new science of history, a new social science. But unfortunately, in my view, they don't specify anything. And they actually fall back on talking about egalitarian versus, non-egalitarian social structures, when I thought they trashed the concept of egalitarianism. And they said we should be talking about freedom, not equality. But anyway, chapter 8 said, anyone who adheres to the word they use is scale, population scale, as determining social structure, namely the amount of freedom in the social structure, is wrong, because here's a bunch of examples where there is dense social structure and all different, here are a couple of examples where there are dense population scales and various, completely contradictory social structures. Some are very hierarchical and some have high degrees of freedom. Mm-hmm. So to me, and this is what I said last week, if the whole book was just everybody else is wrong or all kinds of determinism is wrong, then we can start saying, are they right about the facts? But, my first pass is I'm going to assume all the facts they bring up are true. I'm trying to figure out what their theory is. Mm-hmm. So, in these two chapters, they really don't put forward their positive theory other than to say, since these weren't determined by population scale, and they weren't determined by agricultural mode of production, it must have been a form of autonomy or self-determination. And we should take these as very optimistic signs that we have lots of opportunities to shape our world today.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Go ahead, Dustin.
Can I jump in? I think I kind of agree with you, Mike, that it was they kind of set us up, and then if we accept their statement of facts as representative of what's actually there, then it's fairly I thought it was fairly straightforward reading now that I've finally kind of gotten on board with their style. I think that the couple of things I wonder about are they seem to say, I think that I think I'm understanding this correctly, that farming occurred because there was a settling of the environment after the end of the last glacial period. There was erratic river flows and the sea level was up and down and stuff. And they say at some point this settled down and allowed stable deltas to form and floodplains to become more manageable to live on. And that provided the environment for large scale farming to occur. And then because people naturally congregated at these richer, easy places to forage, like river deltas and things like that, they were able to scale up their previously small scale agriculture to things the size of the Nile Delta or the Tigris or whatever, and support these big cities. And to me, that sounds a bit like falling from one local minima into another one, which does kind of go against their hypothesis that we have lots of different options. Is we went from being self-sufficient foragers where we could, we might organize our social group in all kinds of different ways, but we could always just leave because we were producing our own food. Maybe I'm reading a little more into what they were saying, but that's what it sounded like they were saying. And now that we've gotten our scale of population to a degree that we're required to farm in order to feed our people, that does feel a bit like we're trapped on this other side. Whatever the mode is, maybe we can reconfigure our social hierarchy or turn something that's not that way. But short of reducing population, there's not any going back away from farming. So
what about this idea of play farming in between, right? This sort of the tidal or flood plain
for the small lakes and rivers, not for the Nile.
Well, I think in the situation of the Nile, there is a period from about 5,000 BCE to about 3,100 when the first dynasty begins, so there's like almost, 2,000 years where there is agriculture going on, and there is settlement, and there are towns, if not cities, and and they don't immediately scale up to this point of no return that you seem to be talking about, Justin, where they but it does, I mean, it sort of does beg the question, once you've got so much population, right, then then is there a scale, or is there a density at which it does become difficult to say, well, okay, we're going, we're not going to have a temple, we're not going to store the surplus, and we're not going to regulate, when it gets, when planting gets done, and when, food gets distributed and all that kind of stuff. It seems like there might be a moment where I don't feel like I don't feel like I was satisfied that there's a, that there's, I think I do kind of, I mean, there's this dichotomy of inevitability versus agency, right? But I'm not sure that I completely understand, where, aside from that it's complicated and it varies based on local, the local situation. I'm not sure what else I learned.
Yeah, like so were they was there sufficient randomness or chaos in the Nile River Delta for those 2,000 years that prevented them from having a population explosion that then required them to do farming, or was there an actual will to do it differently? They understood population explosions well enough that they could avoid them for 2,000 years. I don't know, man. We can't do that today. So I'm a little skeptical. I don't know. I'd be happy to hear other folks' opinions about that.
One thing that I thought was kind of interesting was how I think it's some of the earlier chapters, they talk about how a lot of hunter-gatherers, especially today, are in this undesirable land because they've basically been forced out by all of these people farming. But then in chapter 7, they're basically talking about the opposite, about all of these people who were it sounds like maybe they weren't forced into farming, but they had to farm on this really undesirable land. So I thought that was really interesting, that maybe there seems to be some sort of power that is independent of power or influence that doesn't depend on being like a hunter-gatherer or a forager or in agriculture, but who has control to kind of literally kill people or push people around or whatever. And it's not what people do with the land when they have it, seems kind of up to them, I guess.
Are we buying this story of Teotihuacan backing away from hierarchy, the way they kind of narrate it?
Was that this week? I don't think that was this week. Was it?
Oh, is it not? They mention it I think in 8, don't they?
They say something about Teotihuacan that comes up when they're saying people collected in this city of 100,000 people because they were avoiding volcanoes, which was not enough information for me to decide what the heck that meant.
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe it's 9 where they actually talk about all right.
Okay.
All right.
Spoilers.
Right. Sorry. Because I was just scrolling and I saw how they were talking about it, but maybe they just kind of, maybe they're just given a little taste and then they kind of go into details, because they do, I mean, later, maybe it is in 9, they do make this argument that, that the big monuments are built, but then, then the idea of the king of Teotihuacan is something that is sort of honored in the breach, or it's talked about, the kingship is talked about elsewhere in the Mayan world, but not at the actual site. So that, and so we can talk about that next week, maybe, that there's this idea that there's something, that again, once again, maybe there is a kind of a decision that's made about what people really want to do.
To me, one of the interesting things is they give a couple of examples. I think one was, and I might get this wrong, but one I think was the U.S. Southwest, and then the other was like Amazonia. I think in Amazonia they say they didn't use manioc until the Spaniards arrived, and then I think in the U.S. Southwest they say that they had agriculture and then they consciously rejected it and returned to foraging.
So I recall, like I was reading, I read Collapse by Diamond a few years ago, so I might be misremembering this, so please correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought he made the argument about the American Southwest that the environment changed and it wasn't regular enough to support farming anymore, and that's why they returned to foraging. But so that's conflicting with this argument. But again, I read it a few years ago. I don't have the book anymore, so I couldn't go and check that I remembered right.
Yeah, I think they do say a couple of times that there is less, there seems, although they also seem to kind of be sort of tentatively saying it, like there seems to be a degree of de-emphasis of kind of settled agriculture, but that I mean that could mean a lot of things. I don't think that I'm convinced that the people in the Amazon weren't using manioc before the Spaniards. I might be more convinced that they were using many things before the Spaniards, and then they came to rely more heavily on only manioc after the Spaniards. Because I think there's a lot of that whole, they do, and I think they do talk about terra preta in these chapters, right? And this whole idea that there's a whole lot going on in the Amazon, and that actually is one area where sort of in terms of the way they tell their story, there are ways to do this kind of popular, trade press history that do talk more about kind of the story of how things change. Like, and I'm thinking, for example, of Charles Mann in 1491, 1493, where he talks, and I think it's 1491, where he talks about the Amazon and this argument that had been going on, a generational argument about whether or not the Amazon could support large populations, right? And the argument against it was made by, if I recall, Betty Meggers, and her thing was, well, the only way to support large populations is by slash and burn, because that's the way we do it. And then since her, I mean, she was a generation ago, and since then, people like Anna Roosevelt have been finding a whole lot more people, a whole lot more pottery, especially in the Amazon Delta, and places like Marajo, and that has led to the discovery of terra preta and the idea that a whole lot of different tree crops were central to the food supply, and not just manioc. But manioc is interesting too, right? Because it does have the advantage of being a perennial, right? It's not maize. It's not an annual that has to be, replanted every year. It's kind of a store of value, and also of subsistence. Right? It's money in the bank. I mean, they date on 269. They're talking about it going back to 7,000 BC, and maize and squash similarly. I think a lot happens, of course, after horses are available in the after the herds of the conquistadors. escape, and and then the Plains Indians have a different opportunity. But one of the things that happens in that change, right, is that the social value of women decreases quite substantially, right, because their contribution is all of a sudden a whole lot less relevant.
What contribution do you mean
As food suppliers.
as food suppliers?
Yeah, once the Plains Indians are living on the buffalo hunt.
Yeah, I'm wondering if they talk more about gender. They've kind of alluded to it a little bit, but not that much.
Yeah, an aspect that I was definitely going to look into more was like this. I don't remember if it was this chapter or the previous chapter when they talk about like weaving and any kind of like textiles having a lot to do with structure and time and other like abstract concepts. I was like, whoa, I never. This is super cool. I want to know more about this. But it was only that one sentence, I think, so far. So yeah.
Yeah,
Anything
last
else?
chapter they were saying the basis of science was the
Yeah.
women. Yeah.
Super cool.
Yeah, well, and also, and in kind of an inversion, they were also saying that the basis of sort of social structure
Yep.
was these lowland, agricultural, more, places where women had more influence, right? Had probably more, were a bigger part of running things, and they. At the end of that chapter, I think it was chapter 6, wasn't it? Where where they're saying that it's in these places where there's more hierarchy, ironically, in these places that we had previously maybe thought. I mean, so it's like everything gets stood on its head, right? So we thought that matriarchal societies were the good guys, and now maybe they're not, and maybe these guys up in the hills, who are living this macho, hunting and fighting life. But no, wait a minute, they turn out to be the raiders who come in and and despoil the agriculturalists, and so so there's no good guys and no bad guys. It's just a bunch of guys, like they say in the Zero Effect.
My problem with their discussion of women's, gender hierarchy, gender domination, is I don't feel it was integrated well into their theory, because without putting forward their positive theory, which I think they have implicit, I don't think they state their positive theory explicitly.
Mhm.
They state their negative criticisms quite explicitly.
Yeah.
But let's review what their theoretical concepts are. And they came early in the book. There are these 3 degrees of freedom.
Right.
There's the freedom to leave, there's the freedom to disobey, and there's the freedom to play with social structure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if they have any contribution, because let's face it, everybody acknowledges, I think, that over the last, you put in the number, over the last X number of decades, lots of anthropologists have agreed that the data suggests that these new sites violate a lot of simplistic deterministic theories.
Mm-hmm.
So if we accept that as the data, then presumably what's innovative about this book is not the data, but the theory.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what are the theoretical concepts?
Right.
The 3 kinds of freedom and schismogenesis.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost as if they were planning a second and third volume, and then Graeber died.
Right.
And Wengrow said, "Oh, damn it, I have to jam some of this in."
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if to me, the stuff about women was fascinating, but to me, that's like, history is just one thing after another kind of stuff.
Mhm.
You know,
Yeah,
what I really want to get from this book is, can you give me a new way to look at the relationship between social structure and other stuff?
yeah, yeah.
I
One of
don't. I
the,
kind of like. Dan, do you want to jump in first, or I had a reaction to that?
yeah, go ahead and react, and then I'll jot something down, and then I'll say it after.
So I kind of, my takeaway so far of the book is like any kind of reductive theory they're going to try and put forward of the history and technological and social development of our species is like suspect. Anything we've read before, it's all like not either didn't have the facts to represent or is just trying to be too simple. And they do they do say, I think it's in chapter 1, they say something about like, it's always a cartoon so that we can look at it differently and come up with something that you didn't notice before, which I think is reasonable. But at the same time, like our imaginations, and we've kind of stated as an assumption at the beginning of the book that these people 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 180,000 years ago had the same level of imagination that we do today. Like, I mean, we can't predict our economy today. We can't predict we're not going to be able to systematize our species in the past either. That's basically my takeaway. That it's like, good luck making a theory, basically.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, and yeah. So it's too simple, I think, and and maybe actually, ironically, they're saying that that these people were more sophisticated than we are, because the thing that sort of strikes me about this, since we started talking about about gender, is that there is so much for them to argue against, and there is so much for them to knock down, before they even start building stuff up. And it is not only too simple, but it's also too mythically informed, or ideologically informed. And I'm thinking
Projecting.
Yeah, I'm thinking of
projecting.
like Carolyn Merchant, for example, at at Berkeley, Death of Nature, right? It's all Francis Bacon's fault, damn it. And this, this kind of, masculine, dualistic, scientific, rational thing, that destroyed the feminine, matriarchal myth, that was, that she believed had existed at one point. I mean, there's so much of that to, that they have to do battle with before they can even start. I think, I think actually, like, maybe you're right. Maybe that, maybe this was the, the knocking, the basically just bashing all the idols. And then later they were going to come back and say, okay, now that we have sort of put paid to all of that, let's talk about, what types of, theory we can come up with, what types of, generalizations maybe we can make. Although I think they're going to be, even so, there were going to be much fewer and farther between, right? Because the point seems to be again and again that local conditions are more determinative than big, determinism.
Whoa, well, I mean, that's not my takeaway. Not local conditions. What they say, as far as I can see, is the deliberations of the group. And that could be based on local conditions. It could be based on cultural identity. It could be based on whatever the group decides they want to base their decisions on.
It could be based on schismogenesis, depending on who's next door.
Yeah.
That plus random walk through history, or it's just random chance plus avoiding what your neighbor's doing that you don't like, plus environment. It's just random.
Yeah.
I feel like we can't divorce ourselves from the fact that, I mean, they do kind of talk about this a little bit in the book, that like so much of inequality comes from colonialism and from slavery. Like I don't know if anyone knows this book, like Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram Kendi. It's a long history of slavery, and basically his argument is people had economic incentives to enslave people, and then they basically developed racism and scientific racism to justify it. So I thought it was, I do want to contrast the conception of slavery in this book, because I think they talked about it a couple chapters ago, but I forget exactly what they said. But I think that's something, and Mike and I talked about this a while ago when we were reading Braiding Sweetgrass. It's like, which is this book about indigenous ways of being. And, this book also talks about how there's this indigenous critique of the Enlightenment, but at the end of the day, like, colonists were a bunch of assholes and murdered people. Like, I feel like that's part of the reason things are the way that they are today, is that maybe like they got lucky that they got gunpowder or something like that. That's the guns, germs, and steel argument, right? But like, I think a big part of it is because people were jerks. Like, I guess I don't think it's just random, but I don't know. Maybe you could make the argument that everyone's kind of a jerk, and that like saying that people that lost weren't also jerks might be misrepresenting. So I don't know.
And I would have a different response, Justin. If I were going to take their viewpoint, they never use the word random.
That's me. That's all me. I'm taking what they said and saying, no, man, right. It's just random.
When Justin makes decisions, I could say, oh, that's just Justin being random. But Justin presumably has deliberated.
So I want to like the piece I think is missing there is somebody has to come up with the idea that Justin, they need to try something.
People do different stuff because they deliberate and they're rational, and reasonable people can disagree. So
they're not rational.
When you have autonomous groups that deliberate, and then you throw schismogenesis in the mix, for him, or for Graeber and Wengrow, it's not random variation, it's human individuality.
Yeah, no, I'm throwing an extra layer on there, that like the ideas that they will come up with to try in their deliberation, which I will also be nitpicky about the rational part, because we're not purely rational beings. We're complicated. But like the ideas they'll come up with will be kind of random, like whether the idea makes sense at the time, whether they even conceive of it as an option. Like that's the randomness I mean. I don't mean just like pure Brownian motion randomness. I mean like that.
Right. Well, yeah, and I think that kind of leads to the question of whether it's possible to, and I thought that was kind of where you were going 5 minutes ago or so, Justin, whether it's possible to generalize at all and make and make kind of a general historical claim about the way, or an anthropological or sociological claim about the way that societies tend to, I mean, is it even meaningful to say something general like that? It's kind of funny because I was listening to, the last week or two, I've been listening to a bunch of Lex Friedman podcasts, and I listened to him. He talked to Lee Smolin, who apparently doesn't believe in free will. And then I got thinking about the whole free will question, and I listened to one where he talked to Sam Harris, which was weird. But Sam Harris also doesn't believe at all in free will, and not in the same way that Lee Smolin doesn't believe in free will, I think. So yeah, so I don't know. It's been kind of bouncing around in my head.
I mean, to me, the generalization they make is based on what you could call an abductive argument. Namely, here are the phenomena, here are the data, and then what is the best hypothesis that fits this data?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we find that hypothesis? Well, we can rule out technological determinism. We can rule out mode of production determinism. We can rule out geographical determinism. We can rule out ecological determinism. We can rule out population density determinism. So what does our abductive argument say? What's
So
left?
what's left? Yeah.
It's the conscious, deliberate, intended decision of the group. That is what I take, because you don't have archaeological evidence showing these deliberative sessions. So to me, it's an abductive argument. You say, here are the data. What are the possible explanations? What are the hypotheses that could explain them?
Mhm.
And they one by one take down all of these hypotheses. So what's left? These were conscious people, just like Kandarank, and they're just as smart as we were. Now, Maggie, like one thing that I think is, more part of rhetoric rather than logic, you read that chapter 2 where they talk about Kandarank, and you have these noble savages who are out enlightening the Enlightenment. And then he doesn't talk about the fact that the indigenous Americans had slavery long before the Columbian exchange, and that there were all kinds of forms of slavery all over the world long before there was any contact with Europeans.
Yeah, but what does that signify for you?
I think that was just a little bit of rhetoric, because when you read those first 2 chapters, it's like, okay, yeah, these people were smart, they were deliberative, and we couldn't, the overarching question of the book is, how did we get trapped? And
Right, but they
implied
weren't
answer
all the same though.
Right, but the implied answer is, well, it couldn't be these noble savages, and obviously I'm putting that in quotes, I don't believe that, but
Yeah.
but it couldn't be the noble savages because these people invented freedom. We got the concept of freedom from them. And the reality is, no, they also had forms of slavery. And where I find it hard to swallow what they're saying is they want to have it both ways. They want to say slavery before whatever this period is, 5,000 years ago, whatever it is, slavery before then was play slavery.
Yeah, but it wasn't, because in the chapter where they're talking about the Oregonians and the Californians, right? So so you've got these people living next to each other, and by way of schismogenesis, one of them is a slave society and one of them is a free society, right? And so it seems to me that although they may have said they're rejecting determinism of population density, I mean, I'm not sure I'm buying that, right? Because it does seem like while there is an opportunity for people to be regionally distinct, right? I mean, it's almost like remember in Neil Stephenson's in Snow Crash, right? It's one of the basic premises of that he builds that story around, is this idea that languages tend to diverge, right? And and to atomize, right? And we go from the one to the many, and because otherwise things would have been different. Otherwise we would have gone from the many to the one, reverse of Babel, right? But that seems to be, that whole thing seems to have something to do with uniformity. I don't know, it still seems to me to be more possible when you can leave one territory and go to another.
I'm not sure what you're saying, but if you're saying that the idea that the slavery is a weak claim. I think it's very weak because I think the slavery that existed in the Pacific Northwest and to a much lesser degree in the northwest coast of California, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to be a slave if that's what you're saying. You know, I came up with what I thought was a rational reconstruction. The rational reconstruction was they do say at the beginning of whatever those earlier chapters were, 3 or 4 or something like that, that with the move from the Ice Age into the Mesolithic, there was population growth. And I gave you that chapter heading that said,
Yeah, right.
Growth led to schismogenesis.
Right. Right. Yeah. And it was the squashing, you know, the squashing of people into that narrow band between the Mediterranean Sea and the glaciers in throughout Europe, right? That they seem to be suggesting was kind of pushing people into more interactions. You know, even in a small, I think even then the population was relatively thin on the ground. There was just that they were bumping into each other more. But yeah, that there seems to be a story that or a theory that they could build out of, you know, all these different things that they just hadn't really gotten around to in this, and that we're sort of left to try to piece together from, you know, all of these things that they have kind of found and dumped, you know, into the pages and into the, you know, 60 pages of bibliography.
One thing that I find always fascinating, and they mention it in passing, you know, this term, the tragedy of the commons. They mention that in passing. So, you know, there is this guy named Garrett Hardin. I don't know when he wrote it. I'm going to guess like the early 60s. He wrote this paper called The Tragedy of the Commons.
Yeah.
And it had a huge impact, you know, because that's when the whole ecology movement, green movements, you know, Rachel Carr said people were worried about pollution back then. And there's this woman, Eleanor Ostrom.
Yep. Ostrom. Yeah. Yep.
So she got a Nobel Prize because she just looked at all of these situations where there were common pool resources.
She crushed it.
It was never a tragedy. You know,
right.
People always figured out how to manage these resources as a commons. You know, they never privatized it. They always figured it out.
Right.
You know, that was part of the discussion for this week's reading.
Yeah.
Because we talked about these Basque villagers, which were relatively contemporary.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they had this thing where they would pass some, you know, the loaf of bread or something from one household to the next door neighbor, and you know, these elaborate mathematical systems for sure.
Oh yeah, he goes crazy on that in debt, doesn't he? Yeah.
No, well, no, but I mean, in today's reading, he says, look, you know, we could have had big cities and we could have managed, you know, all of these resources without there being a tragedy of the commons, because let's look at contemporary Basque villages. And, you know, they have groups which are larger than Dunbar's number, you know, they're larger than 150.
Right.
And they don't require hierarchy and they don't require privatization of the property in order to manage the commons.
Right.
And, you know, that was one of the things I was actually hoping they might stress a little more.
Do you think that you can do that and have the freedom to leave like that? I mean, I think it's great. I think it's super interesting. Now just because we had those two things in this conversation, I wanted to wait, does that work in the situation where you can have people leave whenever they want?
Yeah, I think it does, because they forfeit their spot in the game, right?
I guess, like, to me, I agree with that when it's a small number of people that leave rarely, but when you start to have 20% of the population turning over every season, like, I kind of start to doubt that system will just naturally work anymore. I do think, like, being able to figure out how to manage the commons, something will be made to work, but whether it would be that one or not, I don't know. Dubious, but without basis.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess yeah, you're right. It wasn't in, I thought I remembered it from Debt, but maybe I saw it someplace else. Yeah, but I've run into the story of the Basques before. Yeah, it's in here on 295, 296.
Unsu, we haven't heard anything from you. I wonder if you have any different direction you want to go, or.
Yeah, no, sorry for not contributing. I have to confess, I actually haven't read the chapters, and I missed out on the last couple of meetings. The second one, because I didn't realize the date changed, and then the most recent one I couldn't make it. But I just wanted to check in anyway, because I just wanted to just absorb the ideas of the book through osmosis, and I really appreciate just being a silent participant. Enjoyed learning about schismogenesis. That was a new term for me. Had to look it up. So, I will, speak of people leaving groups, I will have to leave soon anyway. So, but hey, thanks, Justin, for bringing me into the conversation.
Yeah, you bet. Actually, you mentioned schismogenesis. There was one part that I don't think I quite understood, one passage where they were talking about in the Amazon about these two different groups that are strongly interleaved, I think they said, but still maintained their own identities. And I felt like that was, like, somehow kind of different than schismogenesis. But maybe, does anybody know? Like, I marked the iBooks page number, which is not helpful for anybody, I think.
Is that kind of when they were talking about culture areas, maybe? And they were talking about how even if people don't have the same language, they, like, are still more similar to each other than people who do have the same language. That would kind of contradict some of these schismogenesis. This is why people, like, separate themselves and intentionally. I don't know how much I believe this schismogenesis thing as a concept. I don't know. I mean, I think maybe people do. On the other hand, I think there's huge polarization, like, in US politics today. So, like, maybe the whole, like, tribalism camps kind of thing, maybe you just want to think that we can be more individual and independent thinkers than that, but maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe if we get a more developed description of schismogenesis that's a little more pedagogical or rigorous, so that we can, instead of taking this, like, they use it a lot, and they do bring up a lot of examples, but it still is, like, left to us to kind of decide what exactly is meant by the term. Because I kind of agree. I'll buy into it for the sake of this book, but I'm not so sure either.
What I find interesting is also, what is the function of that concept for their theory? And my response to that is, look, so far we have this concept of freedom, right? Freedom to leave, freedom to disobey, and freedom to play around with different social structures. Now, at one point, they say the freedom to disobey is primordial. So, despite them bashing all these state of nature views of the world, when you say the freedom to disobey is primordial, we have this fundamental innate resistance to being told what to do. That's what they say. So that's state of nature. I mean, that's innate. We're born with it. Now, just because we're born with it doesn't mean it can't be overridden. Just like we might have a fundamental innate drive to dominate other people. But we could create social structures at a different level of analysis, which dampen that innate individual drive. So just because something's innate doesn't mean you therefore have to structure society to encourage that trait.
Right. It's like the argument that Darwinian selection doesn't apply if you have choice.
Right. So they say we have this primordial drive to resist being told what to do. Now, if that's the case, you need to have something to explain why are people shitty to each other, even before you have the Columbian Exchange. So schismogenesis provides, it provides a kind of countervailing force.
Don't you think that's also why they even though they bash the people who talk about these societies in terms of primates, right? Like they bash Pinker for doing that, or Harari. I'm not sure which one it was. Probably both of them. But then the next thing they, in the next paragraph, they're talking about these theories that are basically primatology theories applied to humanity, right? So there seems to be kind of a kind of biological evolutionary thing that has replaced these earlier Enlightenment ideas of primordial natural man and all of that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's instead of like was it chapter 1 or chapter 2? The first week they talked about this guy. Oh, what was his name? I can't remember the guy's name, but he says, "Look, this guy really had it down."
Boehm.
What was his name?
It was Boehm, wasn't it?
Yeah, Boehm. Thank you,
Yeah.
Christopher Boehm. So, they liked him because this guy claimed that these early hunter-gatherers were egalitarian, but then they didn't like him because he didn't go far enough and say, look, they don't have to be egalitarian. It's the product of deliberate choice.
Right.
But what does Boehm use as his theoretical primitive? He has this reference to a Darwinian innate drive to dominate.
Mm-hmm.
And, Freud has the same thing, is civilization and its discontents. What does Freud say? He says, look, you can't have communism. And, he would also be saying, you can't have this kind of stateless anarchism. And Freud, when he really gets pushed to the wall, he says, because people are always going to, even if there's no private property, there's going to be conflict over sexual partners.
Mm-hmm.
And that's fundamental.
Right.
So, where Boehm uses domination and Freud uses competition over sexual partners, what they're going to throw in as this kind of their fundamental selfishness is schismogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
This desire to oppose other humans.
Right, and it has maybe some type of, yeah, I mean, that seems to be the evolution seems to be kind of the go-to, right? For people who want to get past this, this Enlightenment era thing, but want to say, there's a reason why people are the way they are, right? And so everybody's doing it. Kahneman's doing it. Taleb is doing it. They're all kind of pointing at, these are hardwired evolutionary imperatives.
So, I mean, Justin asked, then how do you leave, right? So, I mean, because they don't answer it. I mean, I've done an inspectional reading of the whole book, and I keep thinking, all right, they're going to answer these questions, and they never answer the question, as far as I can tell. They pose the big question really early on. The question is, how did we get stuck?
How did we get stuck? Yeah.
And as far as I can see, that's what I've done. I've tried to construct a rational thread that answers it, but I don't see one explicitly in their book.
Mm-hmm.
So you
Well,
know,
I think there are two potential answers, right? And one of them might even be that we got stuck for all of the reasons that the cliched reasons that we think we got stuck, but they weren't inevitable. Right? That would be a solution to to kind of the puzzle. Right? Would be that yes, things did happen pretty much the way they happened, and pretty much for the reasons that we think they happened, but it didn't have to be.
It also just
but you're saying we're stuck. I mean, isn't the whole thing we're not stuck? I'm sorry, man.
I
I
don't.
think they do think I think they do think that we're stuck. I've been trying to think, well, what would my answer to be like, how did we get stuck? I think a lot of it, maybe it started with this deliberation or with this narrative, and then it's kind of this snowball. Whereas I think one of the big challenges is like a lot of anarchist thought, or like reformation versus revolution, these kinds of political theories, is that we just have so many more people and so much more infrastructure, and a lot of us can't like subsist on our own, and don't know how to grow food, and all or forage. So there's even if we could take even if everyone believed that there wasn't an alternative way to live, which I think a lot of people don't, the actual process of untangling and getting back towards that is really, really difficult. There's a lot of there's this podcast called Nice Try that I want to listen to, that's about like utopian societies and how they've all failed.
Yeah.
And that's kind of something that I enjoy reading about, because it's like it's legitimately hard to do that because of the society that we live in broadly. There's just like so much resources and infrastructure that you need to survive, and it's really hard to do that without like gasoline to power your chainsaw or whatever.
Yeah, I almost liked that podcast. I listened to a few of them, and some of them I thought were really cool. I think that there are people who are saying things with reasonable arguments behind them. Like Simon Fairley in Great Britain, talking about livestock, what he calls default livestock. And Joel Salatin says, similar things in the US about, about grazing cattle, and, and something different, something different from kind of feedlot agribusiness that he argues would be sustainable. Whether or not he's right, only trying it on scale would really kind of prove. But yeah, I think maybe, I don't know, for me, maybe I'm not sure that I'm going to agree with their, I think they are going to come to the end of the book and say, yes, there's a way out. And we're optimists, and we believe that there's that we can pull ourselves out of this stuckness. But I think that the biggest thing is that sense of inevitability. And that seems to be the thing that they're really maybe not as clearly focused on as they, maybe they haven't communicated that focus as well as they might have. But it seems to me like that's the big focus, that it's about, not even, how did we get stuck, but, but can we, make a counter argument against this, a credible statement, that will convince people to at least consider that this isn't all inevitable.
Yeah, so that is one of the charitable views I can attribute to them. We are not stuck, and that's an inductive argument, because if you look at all of these past societies, in the past, social science thought that they were determined. The reality was they were not determined. They had the freedom to play with social structure, and they did.
Mhm.
They went in and out of farming.
Right.
And they went in and out of all kinds of relationships of hierarchy and freedom.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
if we have a true social science, then we'll recognize that just as we were able to create advanced, complex societies in the past without hierarchy, so what seems impossible today, because we're blinded by the false ideology of deterministic social science, today we could create a complex, advanced, technologically based society that has these kinds of freedoms. But a necessary condition for our doing that is correcting the false ideology of social science itself.
Mhm. Yeah, on both the left and the right, right? Because I mean, Marxism is every bit as determined and teleological. It's kind of one of the things that I really liked about, and I don't know if it was in these chapters, I think it was in one of these chapters, was where they're talking about these, maybe it was in last week's. They're talking about these people, some of these people that they're likening to contemporary politicians, right? These people are well aware that they are, I mean, they're sophisticated politicians is the way they kind of portray them, right? That they're aware of their, of what their role is and kind of what their, their influence, how it is derived, right? And that is, I mean, it's almost like, it seemed to me, because like you're saying, Mike, they're attributing this creativity and this sophistication to people in the past. At that moment, you kind of see the lid comes off, and it's like, well, politicians today are every bit as aware that, that we're trying to prevent you from looking at the guy behind the curtain, right? So there's a self-awareness, that they don't necessarily want to admit. They want us to think that, that they're, that what they're doing is not what they're doing.
If we I think that was previous chapters, but yeah, no, totally. So the way that these cultures formed, I guess, and they formed over, they didn't just like one day everybody get the letter and say like, let's all meet up at the Nile Delta and make a city. Like there was some slow, or at least slow on like a week's time scale, must have been on the years and decades and maybe centuries time scale to build up to these large cities that were in this style, they had this form of self-governance, and lasted 1,000 years and then went away. Like to me, I kind of think about this, and this is totally me like making this up as I go here, but it seems like those were in relative isolation. People could travel to other regions and communicate with each other, but it was a thing that took like days and weeks, however long it took you to walk there, basically, or maybe ride a horse there if you lived on a continent with horses. And if we wanted to do something like that today, like you can't just say like, except maybe if you're China or North Korea, say like, we're going to reformulate how society works. Like the rest of us are all networked together, whether it's economically or, or food wise or just by communication. Like we would all have to agree, because we can't just go off to some other place yet. Elon Musk is still working on that, I guess. But you know, we can't just go off to some other place. We have to do it where we are today, even if that means I'm going to move to Europe and do it there. But that to me is still here, where you know, even though I'm in California right now.
Right.
So we are only stuck by our imaginations, but we would have to figure out a plan to get out of it without it being extremely traumatic. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, which you know, 10 years ago in Zuccotti Park, they were trying that, right? And they were trying to, to create, a consensus based, something, right? So yeah, I mean,
That sounds like playing with it to me, but not to be uncharitable, but that was playing with those societies, which is not, no, I don't mean that in an insulting way, but they were still embedded in, the security apparatus of America and the economic food providing system of America and the rest of the world, and all the technology they were using was not something they were going to develop on their own in the park.
right.
So like they weren't doing something that was legitimately going to last unless it managed to revolutionize the rest of the planet.
I assume maybe in the future chapters they'll talk about states, because I think that's maybe where you're going with this, Justin, right? Like, I mean, with the existence of states, like there's immigration, you can't just like go to a place. I mean, you can, or like the way that we enforce who gets to go where and why and how is presumably different with the evolution of states, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
or like if you wanted to go off and forage as a group somewhere, there is no unclaimed land left on the planet. So there's nowhere to go and decide to govern yourself that wouldn't be subject to other laws. So like this seems like a real problem to me. All
Yeah.
I'm saying.
Yeah, clearly. It's kind of ironic because I was yesterday in the, it's startup week at Bemidji State, and we were one of the events that one of the meetings that I went to was we're going to institute an Indigenous graduation requirement where everybody who comes to Bemidji State has to take 3 credits of something that deals with, and there are a whole bunch of potential courses they could take that deal with, Indigenous experience. I teach history of the U.S., the relationship between natives and the U.S. From 1600 to the present. And and a bunch of and there's Indigenous studies, and there's a whole bunch of different departments that that have different offerings, and they're gonna institute that as a graduation requirement. And so the people who are leading this are there were 4 people, and they were all enrolled. They were all enrolled members of different of the 2 from Red Lake, and I think 2 from White Earth. We're in between the 3 major reservations of Minnesota. We're right kind of in smack dab in the center. And so they introduce themselves, and sort of traditionally what they do is they introduce themselves in Ojibwe, which and then they sort of tell you, so they tell you their name and their clan affiliation in Ojibwe, and then they translate it into English. They tell you, and they all gave their clan affiliations, which if that was, I mean, it just kind of struck me as as sort of wistful in the context of what we've been reading about this this potential thing that that Graeber and Wengro say existed in North America in the past, where you could go anywhere, and if you were a Fox, you could find members of the Fox clan that would give you hospitality, and that does seem to be kind of key, is establishing some type of safe havens, and and especially in kind of a digital surveillance era that we're in now. So that'll be an interesting challenge. So we're coming to the end. Any last thoughts on this week's stuff?
There was a lot of stuff that I hadn't heard about. Like, I felt like the earlier chapters were, there was some new stuff, maybe 50% new stuff. Like, this is more and more new stuff. And I also appreciate that a lot of their citations are like in the last 3 to 5 years time frame. Like, so it's like really new publications they're referring to, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to continuing to read it. I think I've kind of gotten on the pages. They're just going to provide a bunch of knockdown evidence to really convince us that you can't go back to those old simplistic theories. And whether they provide us a new one, Mike and I can like argue about what that is, but I don't know. It's been interesting to keep reading it. I'm glad I stuck with it.
Cool.
I'm excited for James C. Scott discussion. Did they talk about him in the book, or was that just an idea that you had to talk about?
I think they do, and I'll look for it, and if not, then I'll try to work it in a little bit, because I think that he has kind of a different, he's got a little bit of a different approach. I mean, his book about anarchism is called Two Cheers for Anarchy. Is the book that he wrote prior to his most recent one, Against the Grain. And that may have to do with the fact that, when he wrote it, I think he was still actually on the Yale faculty, and he was still the managing editor of the Agrarian Studies program at the press and all of that. So, so maybe he couldn't be as out there, but I think he's interesting. It's already resulted in me kind of changing what I'm doing. I mean, I've sort of rewritten my first unit from my modern world history course, where I did sort of tell that normal, the traditional story of agriculture leading to hierarchy and the building of cities and kingdoms and empires and all of that. So I'm gonna, I've already kind of rewritten that and made it much less inevitable. So, so I'm not sure how much student, I mean, it's not, I'm not going to spend that much more time on it, but, we'll see if it changes what the students experience.
How about you, Mike? Any last words?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Justin. Yeah, like I have no idea if I can extract a meaningful positive argument out of them, but it's really opened my eyes. The amount of facts that they gave me that was just totally new to me, and I found it fascinating. And I agree also with what you said, Dan. I'm not that familiar with grand historical narratives of the right. Maybe if you said something, it'd be like, oh yeah, I see what you're talking about. But they're definitely completely in conflict with anything that you would want to call Marxism. And they use that intentionally in one of the earlier chapters. As far as I can see, mode of production is a Marxist concept, and that was one of the chapters. It had mode of production inside of it. So yeah, it's very much of an anti-Marxist view of history, or at least what you would want to call a vulgar Marxist view of history.
Maybe there are more nuanced ones. I mean, and on the right, I mean, there's kind of the Whig interpretation of history, right? This idea that we're coming from this, this scary and violent past to this triumphant present, right? And
Steven Pinker.
Oh, that's Pinker too. Yeah, right. Yeah,
I guess. Okay. Yeah, I didn't think of that. Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, from the beginning of the century, right? I mean, Herbert. 100 years ago, Herbert Butterfield was complaining about his, that whole thing. And I think that probably, maybe there's a more nuance. But I mean, even like Neil Ferguson, right, is still like doubling down on this idea that yeah, that it's the West, that if you haven't read the classics of Western literature, you're not a real human. Right? You're not in the. He said. I think I was listening to another one of those Lex Friedman interviews, where actually what they were doing was they were pushing that new university that they're starting down in Austin, which is really kind of the University of Anti-Wokeism, but they're pretending it's the University of Academic Freedom, right? So yeah, but he's kind of doubling down on this idea that that and his latest excuse is, well, the thing that the West did really well and better than anybody else was science. It's like, Jesus Christ, Neil. I mean, where did all of these things come from? Right? I mean, you're looking at the last 200 years and you're saying that, this is it. But where did all of the,
propaganda works if you want to rally people and they don't want to think critically about what you're saying. So I do actually. One last thing I wanted to underline something that you said earlier, Maggie. They are missing the gender portion of it. Like they just, that's a huge missed opportunity in this book. Even if they wanted to just do it for fashionable reasons, they could have really put some more weight behind that, and it would have been a good thing, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I think they could have. There were things they could have done with, just differences in nutrition. I mean, they got all of these, isotope, analyses of bones and stuff that they could start talking about, differences. Hi, Plessy, go ahead. You're muted. You're muted.
Yeah, I just finished reading the book, the 2 chapters, because in the first meeting I didn't finish reading it. So just now, I don't know if you discussed it in the last 1 hour, 1.5 hours. Did any of you mention or note? This is what I noted. See, most of the early cities that came seem to have, centered on rebuilding works that were done for gods or temples, right? But they seem to have completely ignored the fact that the rise of the cities could have some religious, spiritual, or some God-related reason for them coming into being. Are they doing it deliberately, or did that contribute in no other way? Or what is your general thinking?
I felt like they assumed that you would be able to identify traces of stuff like that, like aside from like the giant bath or the other like temple stuff, so that there aren't things there. So they assumed that if there were those reasons, you would be able to see the traces in the archaeological record. And since we don't see those, there wasn't evidence for hierarchies or so I don't know. I'm trying to pick the right word here, but like religiosity like that. And I know that's one fact I doubt. I'm skeptical that those traces would always be identifiable in the record.
Yeah, I have actually seen some reviews of the book that sort of do attack it for this, this lack of, and it was obviously, it was being, the reviews that I listened to and watched were from religious people, who were sort of, criticizing them for this sort of very materialistic, and not at all kind of spiritual idea. And basically the reviewer was making the point that he believed that people in the past were much more spiritual. And I think that is probably generally accepted by kind of regular people thinking about the past, but doesn't seem to be as much of an element of archaeological and especially anthropological thinking about the past, right? That there doesn't seem to be as much. A lot of stuff that I've read, talk about this very sort of secular. Temples in a lot of these places that had temples, and as Justin said, they're focusing on places that where they don't necessarily find temples, and these are sort of atypical, urban arrangements, but or atypical from what we thought was typical. But even in the ones where there are temples, the temples are like in Mesopotamia, in the places where there are temples, initially seem to be not necessarily centers of spirituality as centers of organization, right? And this is where, the temple is where the grain is stored, right? And the temple is where the grain is counted. And, the temple is where writing begins, not because of necessarily religious reasons for, they're not writing religious texts initially, they're writing administrative, double entry, accounting, double entry bookkeeping, right? So that seems to be a way that anthropologists and archaeologists have sort of imagined this, at least, again, the mainstream Western ones. Elsewhere in the world, I don't think they've given that much thought. I mean, Gregor and Wengro to other places where, there might be, different traditions or older traditions. So maybe that's an element that's a little bit missing. They do talk, when they do talk about these places, they have talked about a couple of places I've noticed in the text where there aren't obvious, like even Poverty Point, right? When they're talking about Poverty Point, right? There aren't obvious material things coming out of it. So the conclusion that they draw is that there are immaterial things, and those things could be knowledge, right? They could be information, they could be technologies, but all of that could be wrapped in spirituality and could be considered sacred. But I don't think that is. I mean, the sense that I got was that is not as central to their argument, whether or not people thought about that, valued those things for what they thought of as spiritual reasons or secular reasons. There seems to be less emphasis on that in the way they're telling the story, was the sense that I got. How did you feel about it?
I just broke into this second meeting just because I finished reading that, and in one of those things, they mentioned a poem, and the poem was about one of those temples in Mesopotamia, in which they celebrated the restoration of a temple. Women don't carry baskets, only top warriors did the building. So I was wondering, how would they organize a society to do such thing and make poetry about such thing without having some, overall arching conception of why are we doing this all together? Is it just a purely administrative reason? That's why I broke into the others that are kept quiet and all.
Yeah, no, I just scrolled up to that page, and I think they don't. I mean, they didn't. I don't think they explained that or contextualized that in a way that made a lot of sense to me, that I found really satisfying. But and similarly, this idea that that the building of the pyramids in Egypt is this seasonal work, and it's like, well, okay, I still don't understand what motivated it. Right? Why are they doing these things? Why are they valuing these things in these ways? I mean, it's one thing to say that that they had a bunch of reasons, right? And that seems to be the thing that we've agreed on, is that that people have reasons that we don't understand for why they did things, and they vary a whole lot more than we had originally thought they did. But I still don't. I mean, that's kind of what Mike was saying earlier. Was that I guess from that, I agree with that perspective. I still don't. I don't understand what it is that I'm supposed to take from that.
Well, so that's where my made up theory that's not extracted from the text. It's me inserting myself into it about
The
the
randomness theory.
random ideas that people came up with that became fashionable. Other people reacted to them and made up their own ideas with whatever they came up with, and here we are today. But I freely admit that it's something I made up myself.
Well, and that was what sort of caused me to go to that place of Lee Smolin and Sam Harris and free will and Spinoza or whatever else, you know. I always think of that, you know, is it like, well, is it free will or is it the perception of free will, or, you know, where does the rubber actually hit the road? And, you know, if you're jumping in an elevator that's in free fall, you know, how does your experience of that compare to the reality of what's actually happening?
I'll think about that for next week.
Okay.
I gotta go. So
Yeah, me too.
It's been an awesome conversation tonight. So I'll see you guys next week.
Thank you. It's been
Yeah,
fun.
Thank you. Take care, all. Bye.
Yeah.
Take care. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.